Well, many thanks, Sarah, for that really perceptive, from my point of view, introduction and encouraging send-off for tonight's lecture. I'm making do with just the lectern mic, and if anybody has trouble hearing, don't hesitate to shout in case my voice sort of drops or I turn away. Well, you've been listening to something else, the Blue Note record album from 1958, where Miles Davis stepped away from the leader's role, deferring to his sideman, alto saxophonist Julian Cannonball Adderley. The cover design by Reed Miles, as always, distilled graphic sharpness and clarity, dispensing for once with photography, deploying just the talismanic names of the players alone, names that were resonant in themselves to the young, as Sarah said, arrogantly discriminating partisans of this advanced American art form. The first to own in London the title of modernist, both as self-description and as an identity in the eyes of others. Miles Davis and Cannonball Adderley would reunite a year later for the tonally and structurally experimental landmark Kind of Blue, and that was where the first lecture came to an end, with its full mission unfinished. That mission being an account of both of the two directions that visual art could have followed and did follow from the premises of a jazz-based Soho modernism. We broke off after finishing with the first of these directions, a mode of graphic design manifested in the pages of Arc magazine at the Royal College of Art under Roger Coleman, its student editor, for three memorable numbers from 1956 and 1957. Coleman directed its designers and writers toward a commensurably vivid yet restrained aesthetic, as the jazz exhibited that motivated the modernist constituency. In the service of that ambition, a Soho modernist's preoccupations like men's apparel and late-night espresso bars found expression in visual experiments that uncannily anticipate the devices of pop art that still lay years in the future. But it's the other direction where we begin this evening. For Coleman's artist allies, Robin Denny and Richard Smith, the decisiveness of large-scale, non-objective American painting, seen in increasing volume and variety in London during the late 1950s, provided a positive impetus, while a commensurable negative one arose from a need to craft an artistic identity as distant as possible from the neo-romantic and kitchen sink holdovers found on the art college teaching staffs. And Coleman found himself in a position to promote this mission even after stepping down from the editorship of Arc in late 1957. Lawrence Alloway, then deputy director for exhibitions at the Institute for Contemporary Art, recruited him to join its exhibitions committee. And by September of 1959, the two had organized an answer to the question of where the art of painting might stand within a Soho modernist's outlook. They called the exhibition Place, and its three participants, Denny and Smith, joined by the wayward and peripatetic Ralph Rumney, agreed to restrict themselves to just two formats, widths of either 4 or 6 feet with heights well over 7, in just two combinations of colors, either black and white and the complementary pair of red and green. We'll see what they look like in just a minute. As indicated by the chart on the elegantly designed guide to the exhibition, no text labels could be found within the installation, each artist being identifiable, for those unfamiliar with their work, exclusively by the angle and direction of the paintings. The intended experience for the viewer faced with this environment made out of paintings was gradually to sort out its logic by moving through it and absorbing its visual cues. Their rules and arrangement positively militated against any prolonged fixation on any one canvas, encouraging instead views through or past or to the sides. From the angle of this particular photograph, in the banded compositions of Robin Denny dominate. Oops, sorry. I just superimpose one in color to give you some idea of what they looked like. While Rumney's bulging dark rectangles face us, as in the canvas that you see on the right-hand side. Here we see the Denny's straight on, and from another angle, Richard Smith's open brushwork, particularly here on the right, flanks a narrow corridor with Rumney to the left. Each of the artists having agreed to maintain a recognizably personal style within the set parameters of size and color. Now, Rumney described himself once as an offshore event blowing in occasionally, and with his marriage to Pegeen Guggenheim, daughter of the famous American heiress and collector, he'd found a temporary base in Venice. The couple had met just the year before, in fact, at a Francis Bacon opening at the Hanover Gallery. And the year before that, in 1957, he had been counted among the founders of the Situationist International, having successfully presented himself at its inaugural Congress in Italy as representing the non-existent London Psychogeographic Committee. By the time of the Place show, in any event, the leader of this legendary radical collective, the SI, Guy Debord, had excluded Romney from the group for some trivial infraction over his lateness in delivering a report on the psychogeography of Venice, rendered, as you see here, as a collage of photographs and texts. And this is part of its eventual publication in successive numbers of ARC, where, I'm afraid, the thin banality of the results, perhaps intentional on Rumney's part, affirms Debord's unhappiness with the outcome. But in the planning stages for Place, the now ex-situationist Rumney would nonetheless insist on the centrality of game-like situations to the prospective viewer's experience. And this particular input has generally guided later interpretations of Place. But Coleman, in fact, had discarded even a vaguely understood situationist component to the undertaking by the time the guide was published, evident in his remarks to visitors on the salience of the mass media, the baleful spectacle in situationist parlance, as a key background to the exhibition. You may not be able to read the part that's outlined in blue, but I can read out a condensed version. In Coleman's words, quote, "A significant development in post-war art in this country, it appears to be exclusively English, is the acceptance on the part of some younger artists of the mass media as a legitimate body of reference. The mass media for Denny, Rumney, and Smith is not a source of imagery, as it is for Peter Blake, but a source of ideas that act as stimuli and as orientation in a cultural continuum. The identification with the environment of the mass media is a significant decision for these painters," end quote. Well, for a collection of canvases which were resolutely abstract, we do have to ask the question, where exactly would one go about looking in the landscape of mass media for counterparts to place, for its stimuli and orientation? Maybe the strongest correlation would have been to media that were not quite so mass as all of that. As the outlook and experience of the Soho modernists derived itself from the musical and visual information encoded in American jazz record albums, so the London figures behind the Place project, as we saw last week, perhaps less so Rumney, manifested the requisitely clean, efficient look in every aspect of the visual presentation, from installations to invitations to personal dress. Then, once having adopted the restrained, put-together modernist look and personal style, having stripped one's painting down to match, the question became, how could one take it further? I think that could happen only if music came back into the equation. Let's ask ourselves, how does a typical small group jazz performance begin? The players agree on a basic melody, often a popular Broadway tune with some interesting chord changes. Then they agree a key, then a tempo, then modulation possibilities. In short, a set of basic parameters from which the players proceed to improvise, contributing to the whole based on the capacities of one's instrument and individual sensibility. Now, the stipulations for place did something similar, setting out 2 permitted sizes, 2 angles, 4 permitted colors. Rumney, because he arrived in London only 4 days before the opening, made all of his paintings in that interval. And the other 2 executed their dozen or so large canvases in a matter of months. Their work coming after the great stimulus of seeing the Tate Show of Advanced American Painting the previous January. There, the wall-filling expanses of Barnett Newman's paintings had made a particular impression. The fact that the prescribed sizes for place were so large entailed a rapidity of execution reminiscent of on-the-spot improvisation. And that scale, such that one could not see over them, combined with their contiguous arrangement, such that one could not see around them, meant that some painting or combination of works would always be in the viewer's field of vision. Now, normally, a viewer in any exhibition has the option of looking away from a work of art. Amid the Place installation, that option was closed. Wherever you looked, you were seeing it, just as sound in a room is pervasive, allowing no way for the listener to avoid it. So for me, the point isn't that painting should look like jazz, which is an impossible undertaking in any event, but it's that it should be made like jazz. The usual analogies are to the degree of improvisation inherent in the technique of a Jackson Pollock or a Willem de Kooning, rather than that of the patient, deliberative Newman. But that analogy runs out of room on two grounds. Firstly, those painters were not themselves particular enthusiasts for the advanced jazz of their own time. And secondly, and more importantly, they weren't painting with anybody else. They had no need to adjust their performances to any simplifying patterns agreed upon with any partners ahead of time. The place artists did so agree, and within those stipulated patterns, retained their personal styles, like the timbres and ranges of different collaborating musical instruments. Place followed both from enthusiasm for advanced jazz and from a cognate willingness to cede a good portion of one's individual prerogatives to the demands of the ensemble. But in the end, those commitments came up against a brick wall of conventional expectations. Expectations concerning the proper hanging of pictures and the sanctity of unmediated visual contact with the singular work of art. Scathingly dismissive reviews of Place probably ensured that this experiment with group improvisation and audience immersion was unlikely to be repeated either by its authors or by its sponsoring institution. It may well be that painting as a medium is structurally unsuited to the demands of collective invention that jazz musicians take for granted on a nightly basis. If it could, though, if painting could measure up to the charismatic models encased in those Blue Note discs, if its authors could fully acknowledge the life-transforming power of those models, then Place was probably what the effort would have needed to look like. Well, in the wake of that setback, Allaway Coleman made an impressive attempt to recoup with the well-remembered Situation exhibition of 1962, mounted in the gallery of the Royal Society of British Arts. The immersive ambitions of Place survived in the requirement that each submitted painting be no less than 30 foot square. Here's an example by Dene. The square root of 30, I felt I had to calculate, is about 5.5. So that would be the sort of average dimension on a side for the paintings included. As did a strict insistence on abstraction, with invitations extended to a much wider range of artists. Gordon House, the designer, there he is, already noted here for his continental graphic style and dress sense, supplied the publicity and program, along with abstract painting of his own. But all that said, the viewer's mode of address to this art nonetheless reverted to the model of individuated comparative contemplation. But one might have found, at the same time, a comparable space in London where something of the crowded disorientation induced by the Place exhibition could still be experienced, even if the effect was largely inadvertent. Young painters admitted to the Royal College of Art in 1959 soon annoyed the faculty by filling the painting studios with so many canvases of such unprecedented size that it felt to them like entering a maze. Here, amid a comparable density of canvases, stand two young, well-turned-out painters in early 1961, Derek Bochier and David Hockney of that self-same class of 1959. Hockney, if not, well, both of them, if not modernist, are then within hailing distance of the style, and Hockney has cropped his formerly floppy black hair into a close cap. Though his dancing skills definitely needed work compared to his studio companion, evident in this brief, very brief, uncredited appearance with Bochier and Pauline Bodie in the Ken Russell documentary Pop Goes the Easel. I couldn't resist showing that. Now, if the modernism of the Soho jazz connoisseur of the late 50s translated into the sphere of visual art had entailed a choice between sharply economical graphic design on one side and large-scale abstract painting on the other, neither Bochier nor Hockney could be so easily categorized, wedded as they were to recognizable subject matter which straddled the two. 1961 saw Bochier find his way to explicitly pop subject matter, as in the Canvas Special K. You probably didn't notice at the time, but visible in the background of their double studio photograph, it was a portion of Hockney's "We Two Boys Together Clinging." Both of these canvases represent a certain synthesis of the two Soho modernist tendencies I've been pursuing here. They manifest the larger size and broad divisions of surface into colored fields characteristic of the Royal College painters just before them, while also introducing within these tissues of brushy pigment the sort of typography and subject matter earlier channeled into the pages of Arc. A press headline about two rescued boys clinging to a cliff had planted itself in Hockney's imagination for the unintentional pun it contained on his infatuation with Cliff Richard, reinforced by his title's quotation from an erotic moment in Walt Whitman's poetry. As Hockney festooned his studio space with Cliff pinups, he unabashedly made homoeroticism his artistic and personal signature in a way that was qualitatively different from the codings of that older Soho coterie of gay artists who frequented the Colony Room. His forthrightness was in keeping with both his and his father's against-the-grain commitment as conscientious objectors, the elder Hockney's stance held in the face of fierce opprobrium during the Second World War. That same confident, wholly unintimidated attitude also partook of the generally arrogant affect of the newer Soho modernists who refused all dowdy social shibboleths on principle. The charismatic character of the fabulous Hoplite in Colin McInnes's Absolute Beginners speaks for this attitude, as does the existence of a significant contingent of gay mods frequenting Le Deuce Club in Soho or El Sombrero in Kensington. Now, by this time, the centrality of jazz, celebrated in McInnes's novel and posited for place by me, had begun to recede in favor of an even greater concentration on clothes and on the more danceable Black American rhythm and blues. Hockney seems to have preferred classical music almost exclusively, despite the Cliff crush, and might have been the klutz on the dance floor that we just saw him being. But he rarely disappointed where attire was concerned, as we see him posing here just a bit later. Likewise, in 1962, a feature in Town magazine on the 15-year-old Mark Feld, here in the foreground with his friends Mickey Simmons and Peter Sugar of Stamford Hill, put the younger mod inheritors of late 50s modernism publicly on the map. Town was a recently revamped title owned by the ambitious Michael Heseltine. The cover design of this issue, I think, speaks for his ambitions, and the editor dispatched no less a photographer than Don McMullen to document the underground notoriety of these Northeast London teenage dandies. This moody shot of the trio by the Regent's Canal in Hackney both exposes Feld's leather waistcoat, the pride of his wardrobe, and inserts the young mod style firmly in the downbeat London landscape to which, say, the TV films of Ken Loach would shortly lay claim. Excuse me a second. The cold is still lingering slightly. Now, Mark Feld, you see here in the center, would become 70s glam star Mark Bolan. But throughout, whatever the style might have been, cultivated a level of fastidious fashion discrimination, probably unsuitable for an artist a decade older. But the up-to-date coiffure and cut of Hockney's suit in the studio portrait locates the artist at least along the same continuum, and he indulged his own posing tendencies with the figure study that he completed for his graduation portfolio, which required a study of the nude figure. And he devoted another painting from 1962 to the dress sense of his Royal College peer and, we're told, unrequited love interest, Peter Clutch, a design student who sportingly joined in with a live demonstration of his well-turned-out Ivy League ensemble. The burden of this lecture, though, will be to show that Hockney leveraged this evolving cultish modernism into a broadened engagement with other modernist legacies, and not necessarily the ones you might expect. But that path would be circuitous. On arriving in London, his first intensive artistic effort had been to draw the college's standard anatomical skeleton, earning him kudos from both teachers and friends on account of its inerrant foreshortening. He was at the same time patently rehearsing Francis Bacon, the studio prop providing an anodyne pretext for the Baconian device of a flayed torso inserted within a tightly delineated lattice of rectilinear space. 3 years later, he was still processing the post-war master. At the Young Contemporaries, of 1962, his third variation on the Taifu tea packet encased a heap of nude male muscle right out of Bacon's repertoire, as here in the 1952 study for a nude crouching on a rail. The isometric tea packet does duty as counterpart to Bacon's box of space outlined in white. There's even a bit of the curving foreground rail over the knees of Hockney's figure. But these similarities, these intentional similarities, also point up the vast difference between the two works as objects. In reproduction, one typically sees Bacon's paintings, as here, without their invariant and ponderous mounts of gilt framing and glass, as seen in kind of mistily seen in the painting's home at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Bacon's agonistic scenarios thus present themselves to their viewers as encased specimens. Decorative objects held at one remove behind the ever-present glazing. I mean to say one component of these imposing decorative objects as a whole. Hockney's thin, irregular polygon, by contrast, is all there is to the work. Any superfluous portions of the rectangular format have been cut away. But unusually for him, the painting actually insists on its framing. He translates Bacon's characteristic spatial cage into thin wooden battens presented edgewise around and between four stretched canvas segments. These lines simultaneously, that is the lines created by the wooden strips, simultaneously do the work of drawing and framing, with the wood motif of Bacon's mounts dramatically made part of the composition, flush with the canvas surface, as if ingested into the painted surface itself. Now, this painting, with his three others in the 62 Young Contemporaries, all appeared under a common heading as demonstrations of versatility. This painting had the overarching title, Painting in an Illusionistic Style. The others were painting in a flat style, painting in a scenic style, and for history's sake, painting in a semi-Egyptian style. That last one, representing Hockney's bid to compete with the sheer size of the sorted paintings displayed in the Situation exhibition, as it was 12 feet long and 7 feet high. In this putting on and taking off of styles lies perhaps the most profound riposte to the entire lineage that a Bacon would represent for Great Britain or a de Kooning for America. That is, an individual manner constituting the core identity of the artist, often clung to long past the point where its potential for discovery or revelation had been exhausted. This wasn't quite the mod's way with taking up or discarding this or that article of apparel, but it comes close. The next year, in 1963, Hockney had another go at taking on Bacon, both the distorted figuration and the glazing all at once. In Play Within a Play, he appended a sheet of clear perspex against the canvas, against which a standing figure in what looks like proper modernist attire seems trapped and painfully pressed, like one of Bacon's specimens longing to escape its vitrine. The illusionistic perspective of the floorboards and chair work against the actual adherence of the transparent plastic to the painted surface, suggesting a narrow shelf of literal space that doesn't actually exist. The figure squeezed into this impossible space is Hockney's young dealer, John Casman, seen standing here, full of mod-like assurance in front of a concentric patterned canvas by Richard Smith. Now, Kasman shared the slight stature and Jewish background of many mod faces of the early 1960s, like Mark Feld, or like the teenage Malcolm McLaren, or Malcolm Edwards as he was then. But his aspect here also signifies that there was at this juncture another way to be a modernist that had nothing to do with the jazz scene or with the men's boutiques of Soho. Hockney's play with literal and fictive planes and Kasman's comic portrait has as much or more to do with American rather than British inputs. Kasman's advocacy of Hockney's art was as strong as any artist could desire. But he balanced that commitment with just as great an enthusiasm for the color field or post-painterly abstraction from Washington and New York. The trigger was a show of Morris Lewis's paintings at the ICA, Kasman recalls. And let's let this 2007 installation at the Paul Kasman Gallery stand in for John Kasman's original revelation. Quoting again, "I was swept off my feet like you are when you see a wonderful girl. Here were these vast paintings that were exciting beyond belief. I thought that's what people should be looking at in painting instead of pottering about with John Minton and Julian Trevelyan and Lucian Freud's dreadful little drawings." End of quote. That's Kasman. Morris Lewis stood precisely for the art that the American critic Clement Greenberg had in those years come to champion, and via his essay of 1961 entitled Modernist Painting, laid claim to that title with a capital M, signifying a now recognized tendency in thoroughly abstract art that dramatized its radical unlikeness of nature, to use one of Greenberg's favorite phrases. By 1963, in the service of that enthusiasm, Kasman had opened his gallery in New Bond Street, which is a whole story in itself, well told at the moment at a special exhibition at Tate Britain or in the literature by Lisa Tickner. Let me just say that the clarity and spaciousness of its top-lit spaces alone were a revelation to their contemporaries. You see him here with his financial partners Sheridan Blackwood, Marquis of Dufferin, contemplating the first exhibition in the new gallery, which, as you see, was devoted to the concentric circle stained canvases of the American Kenneth Noland, close friend of Morris Lewis, and exactly the kind of artist for which this environment had been engineered. Greenberg himself showed up in London during the run of the show to inspect his London beachhead. Here, experiencing in Kasman's surroundings the putative address of such paintings to eyesight alone. Now, this was truly as imported a modernism as post-bop jazz had been. The St. Martin's School sculptors around Anthony Caro, about whom we'll be hearing in the fourth lecture, had actually pitched in to cover Greenberg's airfare so that they could receive crits from this American arbiter of quality. For this wave of visual art modernism, the effect of the critic's presence in London would have been akin to the impact on the Soho modernist back in 1959 when Dizzy Gillespie and Dave Brubeck and Buck Clayton first played live in London when the Musicians' Union ban on Americans had been lifted. And then they would see their idols improve their wardrobes at Cecil G. In December of the same year, 63, Kasman gave Hockney his first exhibition, Conscious of his odd man out position vis-a-vis the abstract painters in the Casman stable, Hockney titled the show Paintings with People In. And it included play within a play, now not only referencing Francis Bacon, but staging an almost literal superimposition of the imported American modernism of Greenberg's flatness and the delimitation of flatness. The virtual picture plane become as literal as Bacon's glazing, smashed squarely on top of the indigenous modernist style code in dress, a quality that Casman exemplified in his careful attention to his appearance. Here you see him with more Noland paintings in the background. On their first encounters, he says he had found Hockney poorly attired by his strict standards. But traveling together in the American Midwest in 1965, it seems he brought the artist, at least temporarily, close to his own standard. The slightly apologetic note in Hockney's exhibition title, Paintings with People In, and here you see him likewise in front of the opposite, Kenneth Noland, suggests protesting too much, that is, a certain envy of American abstract modernism as it had captivated his dealer and friend. How, he might have been asking himself, could he become not quite so much the odd man out? Now, it's unlikely that Hockney set out for Los Angeles in 1964 precisely with a solution to that quandary in mind. But the fact that his Casman's show had sold out gave him the funds for the trip. So he might well have been confirmed in exactly what he'd been doing to date. It is not thinking of transforming his art, leaving it in the state exemplified by domestic scene Los Angeles, which he painted in London shortly before his departure. After an image in Physique Pictorial, a low-rent magazine of euphemistic beefcake produced in Los Angeles, the apron and athletic socks worn by the central figures send up these artfully placed accessories that allowed nude male photography to be sent through the mails. Luxuriant lilies and an exuberant floral slipcover channel the subtropical California vegetation that Hockney is here only imagining via accessories that have thoroughly English provenance. After Hockney had settled into LA and began painting, Casman flew over with the express purpose of introducing him around the circuit of local collectors. Hockney notes on the right-hand side of this painting, called California Art Collector, and not for the last time, the odd popularity in California of William Turnbull's stacks of roughly shaped stones. So there was one British artist there ahead of him. But Hockney renders that weighty attribute of the portrait subject as insubstantial as all the other accessories, including the swimming pool in the distance. This could be a sharper picture. I apologize. Though painted in LA, the spindly overhang and floral upholstered armchair differ little in approach from the schematic staging of domestic scene Los Angeles the year before. But one thing had changed. California Art Collector was painted in the silky Liquitex acrylic paints, newly available, an American discovery that took him one step closer to the transformation that would follow. He said of that moment, quote, I have never thought my painting advanced. But in 1964, I still consciously wanted to be involved, if only peripherally, with modernism, end quote. On his second sojourn in Southern California, which began in mid-1966, the key came to him, one that makes itself evident along his continuing vector of collector's portraits. The subject was Betty Freeman, who stood out in her sophistication in the LA landscape. She'd been, among other things, sufficiently prescient to have bought a drawing from Hockney's first London show in 1961. And in the intervening years, she had come forward as an unparalleled private patron of modern music, a mission that began when she bailed out Lamont Young on a Connecticut marijuana possession charge. When Hockney renewed contact in 1966, as Betty Freeman recounts, quote, David asked if he could come paint my pool. He came over and took little Polaroids. Sometime later, the dealer, Felix Landau, called and asked if I wanted to see the finished painting. It might come as no surprise that Freeman initially turned down this entirely unexpected and gargantuan outcome of Hockney's visits, 2 panels, each 6 feet square in their dimensions, though she relented afterwards and sportingly purchased the work. Here she poses with the painting in situ as the artist cheekily reclines in the actual zebra skin chaiselong included in the picture right above him. Here, another such playful moment in color. No pool is in sight, but Freeman's effigy-like figure in the floor-length housecoat of eye-riveting pink stands on the garden terrace of her house against a rectangle of bright orange carpeting visible through the sliding glass doors. She stands vacantly eye to eye with the head of an African antelope, a genuine trophy bagged by her safari-going husband. Combined with the crisp lines of the one-story flat-roofed structure, as it seems, these accessories acknowledge Freeman's formidable modernist cultivation, which Hockney borrows for himself via the geometric abstraction of the wall surfaces and the glass reflections. The architectural edifice and the composition of the painting as a whole are impossible to prize apart from one another. This really robust and rigorous pictorial structure, a world away from the loose arrangement of California art collector a few years before, despite their ostensibly cognate themes. So what had made the difference? One part of an answer would follow from Hockney seeding the picture with the Le Corbusier chairs as tokens of the international style in architecture and design, thus bringing us to the third distinct modernism encountered over the course of this one lecture. There are overlaps here with the graphic economy of the arc designers in the later 1950s and with the Greenbergian rationale of truth to materials and optical self-evidence. But these 3 versions of modernism all belong to substantially different complexes of ideas and practices. And Hockney, over these few years, ended up rehearsing all 3 of them. Anyone with knowledge of 20th century architecture, and that will be virtually all of you, will be amply aware that Los Angeles had become the forcing house for advanced modernist architecture on a domestic scale. Frank Lloyd Wright's period of practicing in the city during the 1920s had drawn the young architects Richard Neutra and Rudolf Schindler to the region. Both settled in, and their work on houses for adventurous clients amounted to a laboratory for the adaptation of European models to the requirements of affluent Americans. starting with Neutra's late 1920s house designed in the Hollywood Hills, designed for the health regimen advocate Philip Lovell, extending over a long career for Neutra, highlighted by masterworks on the order of the 1946 Kaufman House in Palm Springs and the late Hillside Chewy House of 1958. His inheritors were the architects enlisted into the Case Study House project, as with Pierre Koenig's Case Study 22 of 1960, intended to expand the reach of high modern aesthetics to wider production by using standardized components. The inspired photography of Julius Schulman, which you've been looking at, invested this practicality with a magic that carried their fame far beyond the region. But alongside this very familiar narrative lies a history less known, I think, to those who haven't spent time in the city. These eminent examples we've just been looking at gave rise to less rigorous versions, often by locally distinguished architects, but which tempered the industrial rigor and transparency with things like brick facing, rendered walls, and softening decorative touches. During the 1950s, an entire residential development called Truesdale Estates climbed the hillside along the eastern boundary of Beverly Hills, uniformly built in this style. Here's one typical example of a one-storied Truesdale house, exemplifying exactly this sort of softened modernism. Betty Freeman, the Beverly Hills housewife, actually didn't live in Truesdale. Her house on North Hillcrest is categorized in property records as Spanish style. It had 2 stories and pitched roofs. But one would never know that on the evidence of Hockney's painting. He carefully framed the glass-fronted one-story extension giving onto the unseen pool so that her house is in effect transferred to Truesdale, and she herself into the personification of Los Angeles modernism in domestic architecture. Now, with all the fascination that Hockney's Californian subject matter has exerted on its admirers, and something which I'm sure is about to be unleashed again with the opening of the Tate retrospective, it's curious to me that the angular austerity of his depicted buildings, in contrast to the vivid attributes that he places all around them, receives so little attention. Another portrait subject of 1967 features more collectors of prominence, Fred and Marcia Weissman, she being the sister of the magnate patron Norton Simon. By this date, Hockney has transformed the entire logic of his painting by comparison to the idiom that he first brought with him from London. Abetted by the even coverage and intensity available in acrylic paint, the symmetrical pavilion behind the Weissman pair, almost a diagram rather than a plausible structure, makes architectural modernism into a discrete motif. Its rectilinear configuration governing the entire arrangement of the painting. When Hockney opined in 1964, quote, "I still consciously wanted to be involved, if only peripherally, with modernism," he may or may not have yet seen this solution. But this third modernist input, doubly imported from Vienna via Los Angeles, provided that involvement and a distinct mode of art, harder, more spare, more decisive, directly traceable to his experience in Southern California. That experience, of course, comprised the surfaced aspects of sunshine, water in the desert, and tan bodies. But he dug down, without his habitual irony, to this legacy of technical and aesthetic European modernism. Well, it might be asked, if that's true, then why all those eye-catching details? Well, there's something of the misdirecting stage magician in Hockney. That is, in giving the viewer something so tempting to look at that you miss the logic of the trick. A Bigger Splash, likewise from 1967, serves as the quintessential, most reproduced summation of his Los Angeles manner. But it's worth asking, just how much of the picture surface does the spray of white painting actually take up? Is it the main event, or is it a calculated diversion? Even though people naturally think about broad gestural strokes of de Kooning or Franz Klein when they look at this, his version, Hockney's version of the device, holds a sly surprise in that every splatter and rivulet of the splash is meticulously painted with small brushes, making its pretend spontaneity of a piece with the careful precision visible in every other portion of the canvas. Much more to the point of Hockney's modernist progress is the raw canvas on which it's painted. Not so clear in a slide like this, but all the buff color around the edge is just raw canvas. A quasi-Polaroid border around the image, but in its materiality, harking back to the Kenneth Nolan works on display at the launch of the Casman Gallery 4 years before. Hockney's transmutation of that received modernist aesthetic lies in everything but the splash of white. It's to be found instead in the rigidly anti-naturalistic pattern of intensely hued, evenly spread plastic pigment over the raw material ground. Comparison of the painting with its actual motif reveals how the stretched spatial depth of the work of art paradoxically reinforces its two-dimensional pattern. The motifs climb the surface, and if you just unfocus a little bit, if I can induce you to do that, let that pattern emerge, and it's as if the constructivist or de style manner of painting, which fed the vocabulary of architectural modernism in the early 20th century, had latterly been reborn in a new subtropical palette. So this modernism, perhaps a fourth one in all the varieties that we've traversed tonight, brings me to a provisional end to one long arc of development that's comprised these first two lectures. While they've traversed a lot of phenomena and a lot of boundaries of race and nationality and geography and sexual orientation, this succession of modernisms has not yet opened up to the contributions of women artists. And that will be the task of the next lecture to remedy. So my thanks very much for your gratifying attention, and that's where we're stopping tonight. Thank you.
Tom has said he will take some questions if anyone has any. You often need a minute to let things sink in. There.
Thank you very much for an incredible lecture. But I just wanted to pick up on your mention of Barnett Newman, and basically the beginning as being particularly influential for British scene.
Mm.
What was it particularly that the British artists found appealing about Newman's work, as distinct from other artists who they might have been interested in?
Well, I'd love to give you a sort of chapter and verse answer, based on remarks, say, that Alloway made in Art News and Review and so on, which could be done. It just doesn't happen to be in my head right now. But I think it is in keeping with that somewhat more restrained, undemonstrative aesthetic of late 50s modernism that manifested itself variously in the design and the sort of painting to which Denny and Smith, say, ended up gravitating, having done their time with, throwing paint around and trying to be very openly spontaneous and expressive. But the ethos was such that things got sort of pulled into something a little more self-effacing, even though that self-effacement was all about presenting a kind of elegance and confidence to the world. And I think Newman stood in for that better than a lot of his contemporaries would have done, maybe Rothko secondarily.
Well, I think we will.
Come on.
It's this intimidating a sort of seminar situation, if it will. Oh, there's David.
Yeah, there's David. Yeah, I could and should have said it, and I'm glad you did. And cool, of course, in the 50s has lots of ramifications, and it's been the subject of quite a lot of interesting discussion and research. And it does have a home in design and music, I think, in particular. And to the extent that London Painting had greater affinities with those pursuits than would have been the case in New York, then there would have been that cool aspect. I mean, Miles Davis, especially, in that very restrained, to me sometimes almost pinched tone, as if the music can just hardly emerge. And he used a mute without a cup to help create that effect. The spare open spaces that you get, especially in Kind of Blue, which I sort of forbore to explore tonight, was a kind of full manifestation of what people had seen in Davis's music in the very early part of the 50s with his famous No Net that he put together with the 9-piece group he put together with Gil Evans, a very cerebral white ranger with whom he worked through all the part of his early career. And when recordings of that group were brought together, they called it the birth of the cool. And that phrase then just passed into just about everything that could conceivably make a home for it as a kind of hallmark of a certain kind of style of the 50s. And of course being well turned out, but not being demonstrative or flamboyant, not being Edwardian or anything that had an exaggerated profile, but pulled in close, emphasizing detail, emphasizing texture. That was a cool attitude that transferred itself from the realm of apparel and style to these other art forms. So thanks for that question. That gave me a chance to say something I wanted to say.
Can I actually ask you a question whilst we're stood here as well, just about periodization, because often we get histories about painting in the 1950s, and then there's this sort of seen as a split, and we get histories of the 60s. It's something you're trying to do. You seem to be taking us back and forward between 58 to 62 and in this kind of transition period, and whether that you're really trying to avoid breaking this period into two.
Well, thank you. I think that's true. I think it also arises from not wanting to talk about tendencies that don't have an identifiable, concrete group of people and settings through which they are, brought to life. So, yes, the 60s in another sense will come into it a little bit next week, but mostly in Lecture 4 in the shape of the counterculture, which is not just a kind of cloud of, hippie attitudes that somehow, blows in, but in fact is something adopted by recognizable, identifiable people and advanced in certain ways through certain vehicles. We get the recurrence of the shop as an almost artistic medium. And as that occurs, it doesn't lend itself, to somehow there's a changing period and it's everybody all change. Because I'll be most interested in looking at the counterculture in the way that it was not taken up, or it was resisted by those who wanted to keep to a modernist, cool aesthetic against the sort of hot, flamboyant aesthetic that the counterculture represented, which I think makes for the really interesting story of the end of the 60s. So that's a short answer to your question.
I wonder if I could raise the thorny subject of class. One of the things that always comes to my mind when I think of Hockney is that he was a working class boy made good.
Mm-hmm.
Came to London in the kind of Joe Lampton room at the top kind of situation. And there's something about the Hockney moving to LA and those paintings of the collectors, where the collectors look quite grotesque. And he's kind of slightly taking the piss out of them. And there's something about the rise of the working class aesthetic from the 1950s to the 1960s in film, television, popular music, the photograph of Mark Field, but also that kind of notion of, say, the early mod Pete Meaden, who described the modernist aesthetic as being, I think, with elegant living under difficult circumstances. I think Hockney painting his way out.
Yeah, I think that's all really good. I hesitate to draw Hockney too much into the modernist ethos because, he didn't live it in quite the same way that other people did. But I just can't avoid thinking that it was all around him and guided decisions he made. And the class, last week, I made what will be the start of what will be a longer argument with cultural studies, which has kind of put a class grip on everything having to do with mod style and every sort of so-called subcultural style in a just a mimetic way. You have a class and it looks like this, and if you look like that, and you're not in that class, you're imitating that class, and so on, which I think just gets you into a sort of cul-de-sac. But that will wait till the last lecture. In California, of course, people could be rich, but not necessarily represent any sort of upper class. And that was most common. And to have, hierarchies of wealth and privilege and temporarily achieved status was something about which Hockney was, very acutely aware, but he knew that this was a whole different game than the one he'd come from, and the sort of grotesqueries that you observe, which are patent, they're absolutely true, but ones in which he had to enlist his collectors to join in with him, as we saw him doing with Betty Freeman, makes it complicated, hard to describe, but without leaving those considerations out of account at all.
It's an interesting technique to be able to take the piss and get paid for it.
Yeah, Betty Freeman, I don't think ever liked Beverly Hills Housewife, but I think she came to recognize that it was an amazing painting and that she could identify with that. She was a very accomplished photographer herself, as well as sponsoring other artists. She and made musicians, avant-garde musicians of the kind she sponsored, and jazz musicians, her principal subject. So she was really a great all-around woman, but still, in Hockney's sort of taxonomy of LA, had to play a certain part.
Well, we've been given the nod that we have to wrap it up.
Okay,
so
sorry.
Come again next weekend to carry on the conversation with Tom and listen to the third lecture in the series. But thank you to you all for coming, and join with me to thank Tom again for his lecture.
My pleasure.